we're going to be dwelling for the first little bit about naturalism and science, and how naturalism is very, very rooted into science. And again, I'm really sorry for you guys. I'm really not the best presenter. I was a science teacher for a couple years, but that doesn't mean I was a good science teacher for a couple years. So anyway, so this is entitled Biblical Creation, Amazing Correlation. But again, I thank you, and we welcome any kind of insights or comments that you have to add. So Gunter already prayed. So, thank you. Okay. For those of you who weren't able to join us last week, Gunter shared that he was a naturalist until he was 28 years old. He basically thought that everything that's around in the world can really be explained in terms of what can be seen. And so he had never considered Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or anything in the past. I was brought up in the church, in a fairly liberal church, and I was very interested in biology. I had some PhD, thank you, like aunts and uncles, and I loved them very much, and I just always wanted to hear what they had to say. And my dad too was a physics PhD, and he brought me to church, and we studied the Bible and stuff, and yet at school we were hearing slightly different story as far as, was it millions of years, is it Adam and Eve? And I remember asking my dad in the car, do we believe in Adam and Eve? I was in 10th grade when we were studying evolution, and he said, yeah, I think so. And he was just real low-key about everything, and but he tends to go with he tends to go with pretty much anything you'd read in Scientific American. He just gave my son his own subscription to Scientific American this year. He had a special deal. So anyway, but I did want to bring up that I was in high school years, I was confused about some things in such a way that just big life questions, because I felt like we're all kind of taught from different angles in this world, naturalism, there's no God when you go to science class, there's a God when you go to church, and I was confused by that, and I was confused about the ramifications in my life personally. Does that mean I can do this, or I can do that, or I don't know, it was just a confusing time for me. And then, as I mentioned last week, I met somebody who believed in a more literal creation, and I don't think I'd ever seen anybody like that before. I just thought that was weird. But I did listen to that, to what was said. And I want to take a look at this verse. I like this verse. It says, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And this verse is about faith, since it's from Hebrews 11, of course, but it just, if we come to him, there's something supernatural going on there. This is not only something that we would study in science class. And him rewarding, him actually responding to that was just something new. And maybe many of you have that feeling also, like, I didn't know you could pray to God and maybe he would answer or something like that. It just seems like something to be looked into. So as I was beginning to look into this stuff when I was this verse was comforting to me, that the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? And the Lord is the strength of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? So a person who was made very brave by God, David, asked these things. So I just wanted to point out also, as far as career goes, I wouldn't be having a stellar career like some of you anyway. I'm not out there doing operational science like some of you are. That wouldn't have happened with me anyway, but it is, it can be maybe a little bit hurtful to a career if a person would say that they believe the Bible, if they're a scientist. But I just wanted to say that in my life, it was very helpful to believe the Bible. And I'm not being specific about young earth, old earth. It was just specific about believing God was very helpful in my life. And so that's why it's very important to me. And I do like to learn about this. So in some ways it may have been costly to me, but it has been overwhelmingly helpful to believe God, even in Genesis 1 through 11, in numerous ways, just countless ways. So here's a quote, obviously, no. So this is just more like on a personal note again. You're living, you occupy space, you have mass, you matter. So when I started doing some student teaching, and I don't want to be too autobiographical in this, but there was a student, I wanted to have the toughest student teaching experience I can, because I was kind of a little small person. I was 22 years old. I was like, how am I going to handle classes of teenagers? And so I went and I worked with people who were really didn't want to be in school. So I specifically asked to be put in with a teacher who could teach me how to deal with students who did not want to be in school. So there was one particular student, her name was Melissa, and very sadly, Melissa's brother had died the year before in a motorcycle accident. And Melissa was suicidal. She would go out of the biology class where I was teaching, or she had gone earlier in the classroom, earlier in the year, and she had tried to take too many pills. So I just felt like this weight of like, oh my goodness, I had this girl in my class and she's going through a lot. So I was conflicted, because as I was teaching, things on the board about evolutionary theory in great detail, I was thinking that there's kind of some kind of root of naturalism in this, something that implies that there's a really big earth, she's just here by accident, it's just time and chance that made her. And that's not really the message that I want to get across to her, because this might be an important time for her. And so I did the bad thing, I wrote her a note, and I told her, I actually believe these good things in the Bible about life and about how God loves her and stuff like that. I did not get in trouble. She was nice about it. And she did not, I'm thankful to say she did not follow through with her thoughts that year. And so, it just, all of a sudden it was just like heavy on me, like, oh my goodness, is what I'm saying gonna hurt her? Or, do I have to, give this other perspective to her too? So I just want to point out that, kind of talk about the roots of naturalism as they get into, yes?
What is naturalism?
Okay, I'm just going to define it very simply. I'm sure there are much better definitions, but just the idea of whatever explanations that we seek, there cannot be God in them. God, whatever we see in history, God cannot be in the door. The foot cannot be in the door. Like God's foot is not welcome in any of our explanations. Simple, plain simple. That's how I'm using it. So it's kind of an old teaching, an old doctrine. Is it as old as biblical testimony? I mean, if Adam and Eve walked in the garden, it's not as old as biblical testimony. It would be a newer thing. But it goes back more 2,000 years before On the Origin of Species was published, before 1859, because at the time of Miletus, I can't really pronounce it, Anaximander, I don't know, of Miletus, who was around 500 BC, he had already proposed that the first animals lived in water during a wet phase of Earth's past, and that the first land-dwelling ancestors of mankind must have been born in water, and so forth. I just found that in Wikipedia. So this is not a new idea at all, the thing that then came out and became much more popularized after 1859. Okay, this is Erasmus Darwin. As many of you recognize, that would be the grandfather of Charles Darwin. He wrote in one of his writings, Phytologia, Such is the condition of organic nature, whose first law might seem to be expressed in the words eat or be eaten, and which would seem to be one great slaughterhouse, one universal scene of rapacity and injustice. I just wanted to bring out that there was this view that nature was all there is, and all there is eat or be eaten. If I looked at that more biblically, I would say, well, okay, after the fall, sure, there's a lot of that. But before the fall, God said it was created good in Genesis. James Hutton was also an early scientist, not as early as the founders of the scientific revolution, of course. That was a couple hundred years earlier. But James Hutton said, the past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. No powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. No action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle. Yes?
That would be a pretty good definition of
Naturalism.
there. I mean,
Thank
it's
you.
not,
Yes.
so when you define it, you just said about leaving out God, which obviously a lot of naturalists, they're very dogmatic about that.
Yeah.
But I think what they tend to emphasize is that explaining what can be seen based on the laws of nature without any sort of supernatural, miraculous interventions. So you just sit there and you observe, and based on whatever happens in nature, that's
what it is. That's all there is.
Add that up, those processes up over however much time it takes, and then that's how you explain. You can't, that. Anyway.
Right. Thank you. And yes,
In
Tim.
my experience with this stuff goes back when I was like 21 years old, 22 maybe, and I was like a physics major at Rutgers, and some old lady, Bertha Van Loo from New Brunswick Bible Church, she gave me a little booklet, and it was written by some scientists from University in Delaware, Maryland.
Okay.
And it had many different chapters in that little booklet, and one of them was there's no evolution because of second law of thermodynamics, and I was a
Physics major at the
I have
time,
a
yeah.
second year physics major that, and I knew about that. And then there are many different chapters in there, and one of the chapters was some people did not get their PhDs because they didn't believe in evolution, and
Yeah.
I could believe that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and there was a lot of things like that that really
Yeah.
got me against evolution at
A young
relatively
age.
young
Yeah,
age.
and that's part of it. So, and I would call that kind of the naturalistic part of science, because there's a whole movie called Expelled by Ben Stein. Has anybody seen it?
Yeah.
Has anybody? It's an interesting movie, and it's kind of funny, and it's kind of, and he even interviews. Ben Stein is the guy who did help me. The teacher. First, Real Estate Off, thank you. And he was the guy who said, anyone? It was so anyway. So yeah, he's very funny, but he also interviewed Richard Dawkins, who's a very new atheist, in his views. And so it's interesting. He actually got Richard Dawkins to say, is there intelligent design? And Richard Dawkins said, well, yeah, there could be. It could have been seeded from other planets, but certainly not the God of the Bible. So that's what he had said in that movie, but it's better to watch it yourself. So anyway, this uniformitarian doctrine of this gentleman we saw just a minute ago, James Hutton, he said, Wikipedia says, though a uniformitarian doctrine is an unprovable idea, postulate that cannot be verified using the scientific method, uniformitarianism has been a key principle of virtually all fields of science. So what is uniformitarianism? The idea of the present is the key to the past, just like Ray pointed out. Now, in the text of Wikipedia, it does also say the purpose was to extract the supernatural involvement of God as stated in Scripture from history, if possible. Here's the quote. This is just a Wikipedia quote, sorry about that, but it says, in 1785, James Hutton proposed an opposing, self-maintaining infinite cycle based on natural history and not on the biblical account. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you here something that's more of a quote from him about that. It says, we have the satisfaction to find that in nature there is wisdom, system, and consistency, for having in the natural history of the earth seen a succession of worlds. He kind of means, like, I think what he means is like how we see the fossil record, we see different layers and fossils in the record. Succession of worlds, we may from this conclude that there is a system in nature in a like manner as from seeing revolutions of the planets. It is concluded that there is a system by which they are intended to continue those revolutions. Keep going, keep going. But if the succession of worlds is established in the system of nature, it's vain to look for anything higher in the origin of the earth. The result, therefore, of our present inquiry is that we find no vestige of beginning and no prospect of an end. So this is something that is directly contradictory. This naturalism is directly contradictory to what we find in Genesis. And here's this quote from 1 Peter, and it just reminds me so much of this uniformitarianism doctrine. The present is the key to the past. You know, no foot of God in the door in history, period. It said in 2 Peter 3, verse 4, it says, can somebody read this, please? I'm really bad at reading it this
I'll
way.
read it. They will say, what happened to the promise that Jesus is coming again? For before the times of our ancestors, everything has remained the same since the world was first created.
Yeah.
Can
And
you read
then,
the next verse?
shoot, please.
They deliberately forget that God made the heavens long ago by the word of his command. And he brought the earth out from the water and surrounded it with water. Then he used the water to destroy the ancient world with a mighty flood.
So, and that reminds me of only the present is key
What's
to the past.
everything referring to in there? Is it creation, or that Jesus is coming, or all of the above? Just everything?
I think they
Processes?
named the world the
Yeah.
physical world.
Physical world?
Yes.
That's what I take it to mean too.
Okay.
Which is clearly not correct. I mean,
Right.
we see island building happening right now in Hawaii as lakes disappear and lava's flowing all over.
Yeah.
More lava in an hour than in the last 35 years of the eruptions.
Wow.
So things do not stay the same.
Well, yeah, that's
In
why the
physical,
word
in
is
the physical,
ambiguous, so
in
what
the
are you
physical
referring
world,
to?
but I think that God is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow.
Okay.
Thanks.
No.
That's how I would interpret it.
Well, I mean, yes, plate tectonics, which is what's going on in Hawaii.
Yes.
So everything has remained the same. When they use it in uniformitarianism, don't they kind of say like, okay, if we see eruptions now, there would have been eruptions in the past, and that would be why why there is everything that we see. That's the explanation for everything. But in a way, you know, Peter, who fished with Jesus, he's written this, and you know, I see this kind of as similar to the naturalism or the uniformitarianism that I see in the world. So here's kind of his disciple in a way. James Hutton had Charles Lyell, who came after him in the 1800s, and he said, prefer reason to authority. Now I kind of like that, because sometimes I don't always like my authorities, so, but prefer reason to authority. Okay, but then here's his rule. He comes up with a rule. Now, is it kind of authoritative sounding? Just, you tell me. Okay. Okay, someone will read this, please.
My book will endeavor to establish the principles of reasoning in geology, and all my geology will come in as illustration of my views of the principles, and as evidence strengthening the system necessarily arising out of the admission of such principles which are ... neither more nor less than that no causes whatever have from the earliest time to which we can look back to the present ever acted but with those now acting, and that they never acted with different degrees of energy from that which they now exert.
Wow, that would hold up in court.
I know, this is what he said. And
He
he's,
knew he was quoting Peter?
what did you say?
Did he know he was quoting Peter?
I don't know. That's a great question, isn't it? All right, so, and not only that, he says, reason, not authority. He uses the word preach. He says, I think I can try and read this. I'm not very good at the big ones. We must preach up traveling as the first and second and third requisites for a modern geologist in the present adolescent stage of the science. He was really a kind of a bulldog for this idea of, throw out any kind of possible history from the Bible. Instead, we're going to come up with this, and we're going to come up with our own way, our own story. So in Wikipedia, in the naturalism blurb, thing in Wikipedia, it says that in the 1830s, scientists agree on naturalism. Well, here's one who didn't quite agree. This is Hugh Miller, and he had a kind of a sad, story of his life, but he was a geologist, and he said all geologic history is full of beginnings and ends of species, of their first and their last days, but it exhibits no genealogies of development. So you would expect to see genealogies of development if things really went from molecules to animals to man. We would expect to see these transitions. Hugh Miller didn't see them, and he was a long time ago. He hadn't seen as many fossils as they've seen today. Oh, and this is just a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. He takes a little bit of issue with Lyell's and Hutton's idea that rates couldn't change. He believes in saltatory evolution, the idea that things could evolve like more rapidly, because there's problems apparently looking at things like the lowest layers of the rock have lots of different phyla in them. The Cambrian layers have lots of different kinds of animals and creatures. And it's really kind of hard to explain from a purely naturalistic point of view. So he says, he was I don't know if he's atheistic but he said many geologists have been stifled by the belief that the proper methodology includes an a priori commitment to gradual change. So he also didn't completely go along with that. Scientists agree on naturalism. I mean, yeah, he was a naturalist. Stephen Jay Gould was certainly a naturalist, but he didn't have the a priori commitment to gradual change. So after Lyell, historically, came Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin made some observations, which to me can help to explain how Noah could fit so many kinds on the ark that was only the size of 500 cattle cars. But the volume. But he had read Lyell extensively. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, saw the earth as maybe never having had a fall, but always in this changing state, and never really Adam and Eve and that kind of thing. He followed the Greek naturalism idea that things came out of water slowly, and he gave it a mechanism, which, well, maybe it's yet to be traced in the fossils, but the idea of natural selection being the driving force. So I'm asking, okay, is it science? Is it like observational science, or is it naturalism to say we cannot allow a divine foot in the door? I'm questioning that rule. We cannot. And here's the quote. This is a more recent quote. This is from Professor Richard Lewontin, a geneticist, and certainly one of the world's leaders in evolutionary biology. He said, again, I can't really read this too well, and I'm not a good reader.
I'll read it.
You go.
Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
So
May I-
that's.
May I disagree with that?
Must disagree?
Because it's sort of imposing a comic book on science, saying we disagree violently and common sense isn't there. That's simply not true. Science is a structure, observational structure and a logical structure. So he's making something that may have existed earlier on when we're still thinking, you know, the earth was held up by a couple of elephants and was flat. So there was a lot of basic things to really debate and argue about. But as science progresses, it becomes more whole, it has more information, and the structure starts arising. Look, plate tectonics, which is Hawaii moving along, was, I remember, I'm old enough to remember in the 50s, that you could look at the globe and see North America and Africa fits. But that was disputed, definitely wildly disputed up into the 60s even, until plate tectonics became really clear that there are massive pieces of the earth moving underneath each other, clashing, earthquakes, Hawaii. And so some of these things that people would argue about really strongly in scientific journals turned out, you know, to have and so that's what science is. It keeps uncovering. You know, the news this week that there are life-forming organic compounds on Mars.
I heard about that.
You know,
Didn't hear too much about it.
Is you know, how do you fit that in?
The news isn't that they're all life forming or
Well,
you started to say the right
Well,
thing, they're all
methane,
organic molecules.
yeah, organic molecules, yeah. Somebody added life onto
Yes,
it in one
yes.
big, so I wasn't, I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I have a
But may I
question
ask,
about that.
what significance would that be in terms of Martian?
But you have a good point in that we didn't know that 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago.
Right.
So there's a new piece of information, and we're going to start debating now. You know, right, what are the implications of that?
And Doug, I think what you're saying that you disagree with this is that we would also say that this statement is not scientific. This
Right.
statement
It's
is
naturalistic.
based on
Yeah,
Nor
it's
is it
naturalistic.
materialism, he
logical.
calls it, or naturalism.
Yeah.
And he's still alive now, but Ruth has something to
Good,
say.
we can
Yeah,
find
I
it.
was saying, why would it be so surprising if there was life on other planets? If God created life here and he's the creator of all things, he can create life on other planets. I mean, it doesn't mean that we'll find them, but I mean, why would it surprise you if God is the creator of all
Certainly
things?
could, right? Okay, so I'm gonna say, okay, I see this rule by Lewontin, and I'm gonna say, okay, is this a rule? Okay, now maybe nobody here really thinks that's a rule, I don't know, but let's take a look. So I'm asking this question, are science and naturalism, is it two things or one? Like, you look at it and it looks like a tree, right? But if you look more carefully, is it two? Does it have kind of two different roots? Is one philosophical and the other observational? That's what I'm asking.
And just want to point out,
There's another
the
one.
point here is, this whole thing is not science. But science sometimes, and with some people, it gets intertwined with other things.
Absolutely.
That
I think
doesn't
we
make
can all
that
agree on
thing
that.
science, that
Yeah.
makes this a mixture.
Yeah, and here's another picture of a similar situation. I don't know, elephant, I don't know what those are called, but I like it. Okay. So I'm asking, okay, is it an authoritative rule? Because like I say, I mean, I can buck against rules. My mom's in the back, she can testify. Can I buck against rules? Okay, there's history for you. Okay, so you know, we're also not to take authoritatively not real rules. Like if somebody in the playground comes up to somebody, one of my kids, and says, "You can't play with her." You know, she's taught to say, well, you don't make that decision for me. You're not my mom, you're not, you know. Or if somebody says to one of my kids, you know, cool kids wear Levi's. That was when I was a kid, cool kids wear Levi's. I didn't have Levi's. But anyway, so you learn to think, okay, look, my mom or my dad got this for me, it's fine, you know. So, you know, we go on and on with that, you know. You're dumb. Okay, I'm a masterpiece like you is a good thing to think after such a thing. But so is this an authoritative rule? Nah, rules are rules. So what are the rules? So what is my authority in science and in truth? So, and for me, and maybe I exclude too much, but for me, science is show and tell. So it's kind of, so I don't want the argument for authority used too much in my things that I accept, because I see this problem of maybe naturalism is intertwined in some of the science that's out there. And of course, I mean, I've taken all the tests and I had to answer A, B, C, D about, you know, evolution in my teaching tests so I could be certified and everything like that. But some of it I question because I don't want to accept science just based on someone's authority, if it's a person's.
Well, doesn't science always start with an idea, and then they go investigate to see if that idea works out?
That's great. I mean, right? That's great. I would call that observational science, but
Science
What
is
do we accept-
propositional probability. Propositional probability,
yes,
that's what
I
it
know
is.
that's your definition.
Well, that's what it is.
That's okay.
It's
A collective hunch.
A
What
collective
do we
hunch.
accept anything on? I mean, okay, I can't accept it on authority. I could never figure out all this other stuff. You know, maybe there's a few people in the world that understand certain things. I mean, what can I really accept anything on? I mean, I can't know it all myself, so if I don't go based on some
Right.
authority or
Yeah.
something else or some,
Yeah, and I trust things
Collective.
too.
Well, it's a
I
very
trust a lot
broad
of
use of
things.
authority, which you're using there.
Right.
It's saying,
true.
yeah.
Yeah, I think we all
Yeah, okay.
trust
It's
things that we're
propositional
not proven.
probability, that's
What
what
is
science is.
propositional probability?
It's proposed. That's the scientific method. You propose something, you take data, and then you have a probability that it's true. It's never authoritative.
Okay, let's look.
In my
let's look
opinion.
If I could just,
No?
Something.
Some
That-
scientists are here.
No, that's not the way I was taught it in biology many years ago.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
I'm just saying that science often goes awry when authority, as you're using it, gets involved.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, that's all I'm saying. So,
Good-
for
good
example,
point.
let's take a look at again at this. We can't allow divided foot in the earth. And I'm taking an extreme example. I know that most of us really don't go along with this, but I'm taking an extreme example. So, is the rule of naturalism can't allow a divine foot in the door? Is that a naturalism or is that observational science? I think we're all on the same page here. But okay, if you've seen Ratatouille, anyone can cook. Okay, so I'm asking the question, can anyone also do observational science? You know, is it, okay, so in the Kitzmiller versus Dover decision of intelligent design cannot be taught in the schools. You may be familiar with that from 1990, 2000, I don't know when it was. But the idea was you had to have methodological naturalism. It's a ground rule of science. That was what the judge came down with. And I'm saying, okay, methodological naturalism, is it necessary to have that naturalism? It's necessary to have naturalist leanings to do science. So I'm thinking of Isaac Newton. He was not much of a naturalist. He was, in the 1600s. Gregor Mendel, he was at the same time as Darwin. Early Arab, Hindu mathematicians, science, from all over the world. Do they always have methodological naturalism, or can they just make observations, make good recordings? And I think anyone with any ism, if they're careful and if they write down what they discover, can make discoveries, right?
Well, that's what Martin Luther established by saying the Pope can't tell us how science works. Your relationship to God is direct, and your mind is good, and your observations stand, or can be proposed.
So that's what I'm concerned, observational science, show and tell, okay? So if we look at that rule again, can't allow divine foot in the door. If we think about Louis Pasteur, he was, my understanding, he was a biblical believer. And he questioned the idea that life came from non-life, just directly and accidentally. That time and chance is the God that is really there. So he said he did that S-flask experiment where he allowed air into his broth and he boiled it and he made it very clean. And then, for a long time, it didn't not get life in it, even though all the ingredients were there for life. But then when he tipped it and he got the spores that had collected, he didn't really see what was going on, into the thing, it immediately happened. And you can do this at home. You can do this. You have an autoclave. I did it with my students in advanced biology.
My refrigerator is full of that experiment.
Well, maybe things aren't evolving in our refrigerators, that's true. But he brought it from this idea that microbes only come from other microbes. Like begets like, which is what it always has said in Genesis 1. We have clean hospitals because there was somebody who resisted the naturalism of the time. And here's another guy who resisted that rule of, you can't say God or don't allow a divine foot in the door. Let's consider Gregor Mendel. His ideas were disregarded for 30 years. Now this is a quote from Creation. Some of you, might not say, oh, that's maybe not such a good magazine, I don't know. The genetics and evolution have been enemies since the beginning of both concepts. Gregor Mendel, the father, now again, I'm not gonna fully subscribe to this myself either, but it says that Mendel was showing that even individual characteristics remain constant. The whole experiment with the big T, little t, and then the little t for the height was still there, and it was hidden in the Punnett square. So, in a hybrid cross, you're a quarter of the young of the tall pea plants, if they're hybrids, are going to be short again. So this whole idea that those characteristics have not necessarily changed. And this didn't actually contradict Darwin, because Darwin was just saying what's ever out there, there's natural selection. But it did contradict Lamarck. And anyway, Mendel's conclusions were based on careful experimentation, like observational science. He had numbers, he had data, he could back it up, and surely it seems to be the case, right? Darwin's ideas are more philosophical. I don't know if you've read the book, but it's kind of a slog. And I wouldn't want to. Anyway, I haven't read it either. But I do have it, and it's observations. I'm not going to say he didn't have good observations, but I'm just questioning the extrapolation of those observations to that's how we all got here. So let's see. I want to get into here. It's just Mendel was good in the observational science, and it has been very useful. And he didn't follow the rule of no divine foot in the door, but neither did he really invoke God and his explanations. But so now there are people who say, for example, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, the new atheists, Bill Nye included. He says that religion, including biblical belief, is dangerous and hamper progress. So can we really say that about Pasteur and Mendel? The core of their belief was more biblical. Mendel was a monk. And they both gave a lot of progress. And so do people who say that thing have a religion or belief themselves?
Well, there are stupid atheists, just like everybody else.
There are stupid creationists.
What is MAM-N?
Okay, so I'm calling that molecules to animals to man naturalism. If it's just naturalism, that's how I'm defining it. Sorry. Is there a religion or a belief in there too? Should that also be extracted from observational science? So this is what we're proposing. So maybe for some historical questions, a good solution would be to have more a courtroom model. And for molecules to animals to man be innocent unless disproven or something, or for the flood or creation of the flood to be considered innocent unless proven guilty. So instead of necessarily seeking for a natural explanation, we could try to falsify it. So the question I'm saying is, really, the flood should be pretty easily falsified because names and places and dates are given. And that's something that's easy to attack. There's some verses.
So I'm
Yeah.
confused about why a courtroom model would be good. So courts get it wrong
Yeah,
a lot.
that's true.
And we know courts are not fair, so if you're black in America, chances are you're gonna get a much
Convicted,
harsher
yeah.
sentence and be more readily wrongfully convicted in some instances than if you're white in America. So I don't think courts are the place to adjudicate science.
Right, yeah, so what I'm.
I think, and
What do you
I
think? Go ahead.
I think the idea here is that every position can have a hearing.
Yeah,
Whereas what happens, say, in schools,
Yeah.
that our kids in, that only one position gets a hearing. Because it said, this is the only one, this is what we know to be true.
this is scientific. They'll
So
just
it's
say
the
this is
biblical
scientific when sometimes it's
explanation.
naturalistic
Is it
also.
excluded from school?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
And now that's by law because of the decision that,
Kidsmore
Sarah,
versus
it
Dover.
happened not too far
But the
from here.
Supreme Court has
Dover.
started moving, and in the Hobby Lobby decision, there was a minority opinion that blew my mind when I read it. I forget which judge it was. He said, what's the point of religion if people can't activate it or make it happen? He said, it's not just a sentence in the Constitution or the Declaration. That was so beautiful, to support that. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. So,
And just to address this, what you said, we're not suggesting at all that some authority would make a decision of
Right,
what should be
no.
believed about signs and proclaimed. I think that in that
Right.
sense, it's not a courtroom
no,
model.
right, no.
Right.
No, the idea that I'm checking out the can't put God in history rule I'm not really trying to, I'm doing the opposite. I'm not trying to falsify it, but I'm saying, I'm gonna show you some things that I look at and I say, well, I don't think that disproves just the simple testimony of Scripture. So that's what I'm gonna actually be doing. I'm looking for correlation between what I see. I'm not asking myself, is it scientific to believe the flood or to believe Adam and Eve? I'm asking because scientific can be confounded with naturalism. I'm asking myself, does what I see in Genesis 1 through 11 correlate with what I also see? That's what I'm asking. So, personally, I have no reason to rule out God if His words correlate with reality. Because I know I did not make myself, and I don't think that others can rule out, but I can only speak for myself. But I see things around me beautiful and wondrous, including you. Okay, so on to the amazing correlation. So, this is something I was really surprised when I saw. Does anybody know where this is without peeking?
Grand Canyon?
Good guess. No. This is,
Supposed to photograph it at sunsets to get all the
Yeah.
color in it.
it's called the Little Grand Canyon sometimes,
Oh, you
but
mean out in Washington, I saw.
yes.
Okay.
This is, does anybody remember when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980? There was this big, blob on the side of the mountain. They knew it was gonna go. They warned everybody to get off the mountain. And there was a huge, 1,000, 2,000 foot of the top of the mountain came off, and there was ash and everything like that. It was in the air. It was all over the place. And then, so a lot of this ash came down and just kind of settled in places. It was a little bit away from the eruption. And then there was a lot of water because there was some snow that was melting there, and there was a lot of water in this nearby lake called Spirit Lake. And as this all, mixed and combined, it was in a 25, wait, this is a 25-foot thickness, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, but if this is 600 feet, apparently this is 600 feet.
That is just
So
a
use the
strata.
guy
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a,
Oh, yeah.
The total height would be 20
yeah,
feet.
so.
Total height, 25 feet, okay. There was apparently like over 600 feet of deposition according to like lots of things you can read about Mount St. Helens. And this is actually, there was on June 12th, there was a big mud flow that came through there, and that had all been deposited since the time of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and it was stratified. Like we would have been taught by naturalism part of science that would take lots of time to form. So this is kind of.
Are you saying that this took place in just a short time because
Yeah.
of the eruption rather than over a long time?
Right. So this, to me, this would correlation with maybe a flood explanation for even the Grand Canyon. I mean, it's possible, it doesn't rule it out, right? So that's what I'm trying to see. So to me, that doesn't rule it out. And here's some more information about it. The sediment pile was up to 600 feet thick. And within 5 years, it had hardened into rock. And another eruption occurred in 1982, creating even more mud flows, which eroded large canyons. And one of those canyons, oh, this was in 1982 that this was eroded, so it was 2 years after the actual eruption.
I remember at the time, a radio announcer from Seattle said, "Don't bother coming out to Washington, Washington is coming out to you." He was subsequently fired.
Oh. Okay. Okay, thank you. So, I mean, and you can look, I mean, I found something in the US Geological Survey.gov thing online, and it just confirmed some of the stuff about the mud flows resulting, and that can be checked out if anybody's interested in looking that up in more detail from not from a Creation magazine source. So, another thing, when I look at that, I know uplift from under the ground, it's still warm, you get the pressures and the temperatures. I know I've been taught in geology class, but I still look at that and I think it looks like it could have been deformed when it was wet. And so if there was a flood, like is recorded in Genesis.
Where is that?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. Does it look kind of like Yosemite? I don't think it is, though.
No, it's more like Switzerland.
Switzerland, maybe? Okay. But just, you can see, you can just look up images for folded rock layers and you will find even bent. And like, or if we look in the, for example.
The arches in Utah?
Yeah, it's arch somewhere in the west. And Gunter pointed out, it looks like a large volume of water would have carved this out. Just to, like I just can imagine doing this with sand or with clay and just shooting some kind of a water crystal in there and it making an upper part as well as a lower part. Because I can understand why if it was a river, it would erode a lower part. But it had to have been a large amount of water, right?
Or
Forcing.
wind can do it.
Wind. So to me, again, this is something that would not be evidence against a flood. And something like Antelope Canyon, I'd love to go there. Has anybody been there? I haven't not been there. But it's just so beautiful, and how the layers are just so perfectly straight. And if it was like a long periods of time between this all getting laid down, wouldn't we expect it to have a little more of a bumpy appearance between the?
You expect erosion and
Right.
gaps.
Right, I would. This is a kind of something, an evidence that was brought out that we saw at the Creation Museum. We went to the Ark Encounter out in Kentucky. And it said that in Greenland, which is like one of my favorite places in the world, I don't know why I'm weird, they had lost some big planes, like 5 big planes in World War II, and it was called the Lost Squadron. They had never found them. But something happened, somebody discovered that there was metal underneath the ice core, the ice. And normally they can use ice cores for dating, or they use ice cores in science for dating how long ago something might have happened. But in this case, they know when this crashed. It was in World War II, and they know they had, 75 meters of ice, and that normally would be read to be about 2,000 years of ice by more standard methods. So this is something, it's called the Lost Squadron, if you want to check that out in other.
Hi, Sarah, you shared this with me several months ago and
Yeah.
I looked it up. So the issue here is that the ice core was taken in a very dynamic, as in changing area at the edge of the continent or edge of Greenland. Ice cores are taken for dating at very, very stable areas. So you would never take an ice core there and you would never use that for dating because it's known, very well known that they change. So this is not at all surprising.
So this was on an edge, you're saying?
It was on the very edge, yeah, and they were specifically drilling there. They were not, where they take ice cores is where there's no freezing and thawing, for dating purposes, and then they'll go down. But on the edges, they know there's freezing and thawing and things changing rapidly and more layers being laid down and melting, so.
Okay, well, that's good to know that they usually only take them in the middle of continents, but I don't know how they would know that it was stable for millions of years. I just don't know that. I don't know.
Well,
Well,
in case
yeah,
of
I
glacier,
think-
it's more recent, and you know,
More recent.
just from its travel, what's the edge and stuff. I like to say, so, the first 5 years of my adult working life was at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at MIT, and it was in volcanology. And I don't know about layering because my job was ballistics, how they explode. So I climbed volcanoes and measured the ballistics at the top, so I'm very lucky to be alive. I was on the top of the Guatemalan one that is going now, and we knew at least one geologist that was dead, and lots of photographers, all this.
Sad.
But it's, each one has its own personality. You can see the difference between Hawaii, which is all gas and lava, no bombs, or very rarely, and one like the Guatemalan, or the ones like in Italy, where I did a lot of work, where you get bombs the size of a house coming out. Or Pompeii, which is an amazing example, somewhat of what Mount Helens, but it's called a Nuée Ardent. It means the volcano explodes so rapidly with such power that it comes back down, still molten, full of just every evil thing you can imagine, and then it freezes. It's highly toxic, and it freezes. It solidifies so fast. Within a couple of minutes. And so you get all those bodies in Pompeii where people are trying to, they're completely vaporized. They make those as plaster casts in the lava.
Wow.
So each volcano has its own volume of material, its own nature, and I'm sure in layering that, they take account for, that. I don't know how that fits into.
The problem is that you can't calibrate it back. They extrapolate it very far
Well,
back.
you can
That's the
calibrate with
problem I
current
see with it.
volcanoes, that's what we
Yeah.
were doing. We wanted to take the ballistics here and apply it to Mars and the Moon and see exactly, because on Mars, there are volcanoes that outstrip everything here. In Grand Canyon, it's like 50 times bigger than the Grand Canyon here, so you have some of that parallel geology.
There's a lot to learn. Ruta, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was saying that about icebergs. They thought, well, they were melting at a certain rate. And then they find out some of them are speeding up. So the rate doesn't always stay the same.
That's what Gould was saying. He was saying like you can't necessarily always go by that, but okay. So so the question is, we have to check that out, test it out, see how if it's as solid as it looks from this picture, and we got to test things out. That's being noble-minded. Here's another thing. This is a picture from Mount St. Helens, from Spirit Lake, over in Washington State again. And without saying anything, what is that? Does that remind anybody of anything that they might see somewhere else?
It looks like rocks sticking out of water.
Easter Island.
It's logs. It's logs sticking out of water. And what happened was there was a big mat of logs, and they were all lying like toothpicks on the water for many years. But after a while, Stephen Austin is a geologist who discovered this. They started going so the denser part of the tree was on the bottom where all the cells were more squished and stuff. So they seem to right themselves. And so the geologist Stephen Austin is with ICR, is Institute for Creation Research, is trying to find out whether these are going to kind of put themselves in the peat that's on the bottom of the lake and possibly petrify. So he's trying to find out.
Is that rock or is that tree?
At this point, it's tree that's getting mineralized with becoming more like rock. So it's becoming. It seems to be. We have to see if it's going to petrify or not.
That takes a long time.
Well, we'll
About
see.
10 million years.
We'll have to see.
Petrification does not take
Yeah.
such a long
I'm
time.
not sure.
Yeah, you can see,
Yeah.
Fossilization.
no, fossilization and petrification
Oh,
are
okay.
completely different things.
Yes.
A
So that would precede
Yeah, no, a fossilization of a tree has to occur quickly
Yeah.
because otherwise
that's damage.
because it's sitting
Yeah.
in water and you're gonna have decay of the tree, but you start replacing with minerals like calcium carbonate, and that's petrification. And this will happen, you'll find weird things sitting in streams like miners' hats, I know that's one of your
Yeah.
examples, that's calcium carbonate, but it's not at all the same thing as a fossil. But yeah, we know that this happens quickly, and it happens in water, that the chemical exchange occurs and you get deposition of calcium.
So there's an
carbonate.
intermittent state from that, or it
Well, it's
leads to fossilization, or that's the
No,
predecessor?
petrified trees are not fossilized, they're petrified. And there's lots of those in the, I mean, you can buy a piece of petrified wood for a couple bucks on
But how old
eBay.
is that? What's the range?
I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know.
From decades
But it
to
doesn't have
millions?
to go millions.
Oh, it doesn't have to go millions,
no, no.
okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into understand from you the difference between fossilized and petrified, because maybe I confound those two.
I mean, fossilization is something that occurs in strata of rock, and to be a fossil, it has to be associated with a rock strata
Okay.
that you can measure.
That's part of the
And you have it's a different chemical kind of reaction that's occurring.
Well, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so then this is it a fossil or is it not a fossil? It's a fossil. Okay. So here's a fossil of, could they form quickly? And this is something that was kind of curious to me when I started thinking about it, because I remember going to certain museums and they say over hundreds and thousands and millions of years this turns into a fossil. Well, really could it? Because why aren't things fossilizing around us on the ground now? How come a squirrel, if it dies in my backyard, doesn't it become a fossil? Does it just get eaten by beetles and animals like that? But something like that, if it's kind of rapidly buried, it would be more consistent with it than getting these minerals, getting mineralized with, and possibly becoming a fossil.
Is that fish in the process of eating another fish?
Yeah, and so
but
there was a
not- it looks that
naturalistic
way, but not
explanation.
necessarily.
There's a
It just-
naturalistic explanation that would say it died from choking, of trying to eat this. But there's lots of, we don't know, I wasn't there. But this is a fossil of a Diplomystus found in the Green River in Colorado, Utah.
Yeah, there's millions, they've recovered
they're
millions and
discussing
millions
things
of
about
fossils
God.
from this area that used to have water. I have one, it was my Mother's Day present, and
Oh, wow.
it's 3 of this species of
Oh,
fish on my fossil, it's very cool.
Wow.
Is this an extinct
Not
fish?
everybody can say that.
Is this an
Instinct in what
extinct
sense?
fish?
It's extinct, but it's related to some modern species from what I read, and I think this is one of the most common of the species that they found there.
Okay.
And they paint them.
What's the size of that, do you know? Is it
I would
the
know.
dimension?
Mine are 6,
Goldfish.
10 inches, 4 inches, and the 3 on
Goldfish
mine.
size,
Okay, thanks. Okay, so also the Burgess Shale was an amazing piece of amazing rock in Canada. It's considered to be a Cambrian rock, Cambrian being kind of the lowest level that has a lot of different kinds of living things. And it had just some pictures from the Burgess Shale. Look at the tiny, tiny details of these invertebrates. They don't have necessarily hard body parts, but it's well fossilized. And this, it's a Waptia fildensis, a crustacean of some sort, and it's 3 inches long. And it was found in the Walcott Quarry of the Burgess Shale. And shale is hardened clay, fine sediments. And even like, I don't know if it's an upper sediment or not. Sometimes my kids and I, we take a big, tall container of water and we fill it with dirts of different kinds and we shake it back and forth. And even if it's long enough and tall enough, there is kind of a sedimentation that occurs. And usually like the clays and the fine particles end up at the top. But that's really not that related. Another picture, this fish is giving birth. And this is Chile's Torres del Paine National Park. It was found an ichthyosaur, that there were 50 entire ichthyosaurs found at this one point, comprising both adults, including pregnant females. And the researchers said they were killed by turbidity currents and mud flows. But I don't want to forget that also Genesis 7 says the fountains of the great deep broke forth. So, is that related to Pangea breaking apart or something like that? Is it related to some great tectonic events? But it certainly could, a flood certainly could, overshadow something and cover over it and bury it quickly to the point where it quickly dies. So I don't want to go to the end of the time because I know you guys have things to do. But so if you have any more comments.
I'll make one comment. I noticed in a previous slide, Sarah, was it?
That one? Sarah, yeah.
Yeah, Sarah. You said something about biblical examples. You're going to hand out something?
Oh yeah, I do have a handout at the back. This is just kind of like the logic that I was trying to follow, and there's a lot of examples on the back. We have some more examples for next time.
Okay, here's what I want to make is that the thing that moved me from being an evolutionist to being a creationist after becoming a believer, I was a math major in college, I became a believer in college, was I read all the things that Jesus said about creation. Perhaps you should consider providing a category or a list of those verses, because clearly Jesus believed in Adam, he believed in the flood, he believed in the creation story. And I thought, if he believes in it, that means that I must believe in it.
Okay.
So there's a whole list of things that the New Testament authors quote from the past, including Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously, from 2 Peter, and the flood, other places other than Jesus. So to me, that is a deciding argument about moving from where I was to creation.
Yeah, and what a difference it makes to go from, feeling apart from God in the world to feeling with Him in the world. And then, to me, that's my whole thing. This is why I'm interested in that, because, to be basically feeling apart from Him to knowing that He, came to the earth and He did these supernatural things, and because He loved us. That's huge.
I would say one other thing, the Bible also ties up creationism with redemption. It quotes Exodus 20:11, which talks about something about the Lord our God, the maker of heavens and earth and the seas and all that is in them. That's quoted in Acts 4:24, and then it's quoted again in Acts 14:15, and it relates in Acts 14:15 to redemption. This is the God who is redeeming us. So they're tied together, creationism and redemption.
God's story is fairly well integrated in my view too. So, but anyway, thank you so much for coming, and I just want to thank God. Thank you, God.